In
You
a
stay
quiet
away from
suburban
my
neighborhood,
progress!
where neatly trimmed lawns and painted fences were guarded by
Ma'am,
the
step away
ever-watchful
from the dog!
Homeowners Association, one ordinary family faced an extraordinary nightmare. What began as a peaceful evening walk with a loyal, service dog quickly spiraled into a shocking confrontation that exposed the darkest side of entitlement and control. When an HOA Karen crossed the line by attacking the innocent animal, she had no idea her arrogance had triggered a federal crime, one that would bring flashing lights, police officers, and a reckoning she never imagined. This is the story of how a community divided, a dog defended, and justice demanded its place. The calm before the storm. 1,000 words. The neighborhood was the kind of place that seemed built for postcards. Rows of identical houses stretched down long, winding streets, each one framed with manicured hedges, carefully measured lawns, and decorative mailboxes that looked more like ornaments than functional objects. The Homeowners Association prided itself on creating a picture-perfect environment, and for years they had cultivated a culture where compliance was not optional. It was demanded. The families who lived there followed unwritten rules as much as written ones. Cars were parked exactly within driveways, not an inch over the curb. Garbage bins were rolled out only during designated hours. Even holiday decorations had a strict schedule. No Christmas lights before December, no pumpkins after November. The HOA board, led by a woman whose presence was impossible to ignore, enforced it all with an iron grip. Her name had become infamous within the cul-de-sac. Neighbors referred to her as Karen, not as a mere insult, but as a title she had earned with relentless dedication. She was the type who noticed if a child left a bicycle leaning against a garage door, or if a garden hose wasn't coiled perfectly. She wrote warnings for flower beds that didn't meet her standards, filed complaints about invisible fence lines, and proudly introduced herself as the guardian of the HOA covenant. For years, her word carried more weight than logic itself. Yet, in this same neighborhood lived a family who did not share her obsession with control. Their home was tidy but not pristine, their yard cared for but not immaculate. What truly set them apart was not the shape of their hedges or the shade of their shutters, but a quiet hero who walked beside them every day. A service dog named Atlas. Atlas was no ordinary dog. He had been trained with precision, taught to respond to subtle cues, and devoted his life to protecting his owner's health and independence. His coat gleamed in the sunlight, his movements disciplined yet calm. The neighbors often admired the way he guided his owner along the sidewalks, waiting patiently at curbs, responding instantly to commands. Children loved him, waving from their yards as he passed by, though Karen always scowled when the dog's paws touched the perfectly edged grass by the sidewalk. For months, there had been tension. Karen despised the idea of an animal within her flawless world. To her, a dog, even a service animal, was nothing more than a potential disruption. She claimed that fur might blow into neighbors' yards, that paw prints might smudge the walkways, and that barking, no matter how rare, disturbed her carefully curated peace. Each time she saw Atlas, her eyes narrowed, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her pen scribbled furiously across yet another complaint letter. The family endured it quietly at first. They ignored the passive-aggressive notes taped to their door. They shrugged off the warning slips tucked into their mailbox. They even dismissed the muttered words of disapproval whenever Karen passed them on the street. But there are limits to patience, and lines that should never be crossed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops and the street lamps flickered awake, the family stepped outside for their nightly walk. Atlas trotted faithfully at their side, his harness strapped securely, his pace steady and calm. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and distant barbecues. It should have been an ordinary night, uneventful and peaceful, but peace was something Karen could never allow for long. From across the street she emerged like a shadow slipping from her lair. Her steps were brisk, her posture stiff, and in her hand she carried a small silver canister. At first, it looked harmless, something that might hold cleaning spray or garden repellent, but her intent was far from innocent. She crossed the street. Without hesitation, her eyes locked not on the family, but on Atlas. The dog paused as she approached, sensing tension in the air. His ears twitched, his muscles tightened, yet his training held him steady. The family barely had time to process the sight before it happened. With a sharp movement, Karen raised the canister, pressed the nozzle, and released a stream of burning. Missed directly toward the service dog's face. Atlas recoiled, his instincts battling against his discipline. He shook his head, blinking rapidly, his calm composure faltering under the assault. The family cried out, rushing to shield him, but the damage was already done. The chemical spray clung to his fur, stung his eyes, and filled the air with a bitter, choking scent. The peaceful evening had shattered in an instant, replaced by chaos and fear. Karen stood back, her expression twisted with a grim satisfaction. She muttered something under her breath, convinced she had finally put an end to the nuisance she so despised. She believed she was untouchable, shielded by the authority of the HOA and her reputation as its enforcer. To her, this was not cruelty, but justice, a personal victory against what she saw as disorder in her perfect world. But what she failed to realize was that service dogs are not just pets. They are legally protected, recognized as essential companions and lifelines under federal law. Harming one was not merely a violation of neighborhood rules, it was a federal offense. Neighbors witnessed the act from their windows and porches, their murmurs rising into a wave of disbelief. Phones appeared in hands, recording the scene, dialing numbers, calling authorities. Within moments, the quiet street became a stage for something much larger than Karen's petty crusade. The flashing lights of patrol cars would soon cut through the dusk, and the weight of law would descend upon the very woman who had always believed she was above it. For the family, fear and shock battled with determination. Atlas trembled, but stood by his owner, loyal even in pain. The once peaceful walk had become the beginning of a storm that would not end with a simple apology. Justice had been set in motion, and Karen's world of control was about to collapse in ways she had never imagined. And so, as the night deepened and the neighborhood buzzed with whispers, the story shifted from petty complaints to federal consequences. The calm suburb had been broken, and nothing would ever be the same again. The flashing lights, the sound of distant sirens began as a faint hum, barely distinguishable from the evening breeze. Yet within minutes, it grew louder, more insistent, until the unmistakable red and blue flashes illuminated the neighborhood streets. The once quiet cul-de-sac, accustomed to little more than the occasional delivery truck or a child's bicycle race, now became the center of an unfolding storm. Neighbors leaned from porches and peeked through blinds, whispering to one another. Phones pressed to ears as they relayed what they had witnessed. A service dog attacked in broad daylight by none other than the woman who had long held herself above reproach. The spectacle was shocking enough, but the looming presence of law enforcement gave it a weight no one could ignore. Atlas stood near his owner, trembling slightly as the chemical burn irritated his eyes and nose. He was strong, trained to endure discomfort. But the incident had rattled him. His loyalty kept him at his owner's side, even as his body begged for relief. The family's hearts ached watching him suffer, and though they tried to soothe him, their focus turned to the flashing lights that now painted the street in alternating hues of urgency. 2 patrol cars rolled to a stop, their tires crunching against the asphalt. The officers stepped out, their expressions stern and unreadable, carrying with them an authority that even Karen's domineering presence could not outmatch. The neighborhood hushed, the collective gaze shifting from the dog to the woman who had committed the act. Karen stood frozen, her usual composure faltering under the weight of attention. Her hand, which only moments ago had gripped the canister, with confidence now trembled as she tried to conceal it. For the first time in years, her power seemed fragile, her authority diminished beneath the flashing lights of the very system she had always weaponized against others. The officers surveyed the scene with practiced precision. Their eyes lingered on the family, on the dog struggling to steady his breath, and then on the silver canister still visible in Karen's grasp. The smell of the chemical hung in the air, undeniable and damning. Though the officers had not yet spoken a word, the truth of the situation was already clear. The family felt a complex storm of emotions as the officers approached. Anger simmered beneath their fear, a righteous fury born not only from the harm inflicted on Atlas, but also from the months of harassment they had endured. This was not a random act of malice. It was the culmination of a campaign against them, a crusade waged by a woman who believed herself untouchable. Now, at last, the tide was turning. The officers directed their attention to Atlas first, crouching slightly to observe his condition. Their body language carried respect, acknowledging his role not as a pet, but as a working companion. One of them signaled toward their car, and soon a call was made for emergency animal assistance. The seriousness of the response was unmistakable. This was not to be brushed aside as a neighborhood quarrel. It was an official matter of law. Karen's composure cracked further. Her eyes darted nervously toward the gathering crowd of neighbors, their faces illuminated by the pulsing lights. For years, she had ruled through fear, ensuring compliance through complaints and threats of fines. Now, those same neighbors stood silently, watching with something close to relief in their eyes. The balance of power was shifting before them, and they knew it. As questions were asked and details taken down, the weight of Karen's actions began to sink in. The officer's tone carried no softness, no indulgence of excuses. The phrases they used, serious offense, federal protection, potential charges, fell heavy upon her ears. The mention of federal law struck like a thunderclap. This was no longer about HOA rules or petty disputes. This was about breaking a law that extended far beyond the limits of their neighborhood. Atlas was soon escorted into the back of a specialized vehicle, his harness carefully handled by trained hands. Relief mixed with sorrow as the family watched him being taken for treatment, knowing he would be cared for, yet aching to see him in such a state. The community, too, felt the gravity of the moment. The sight of a service dog harmed was enough to ignite outrage in even the quietest of souls. Karen attempted to steady herself, but her face betrayed her fear. The neighbors who once bent beneath her scrutiny now saw her for what she truly was, not a guardian of order, but a bully exposed. Whispers filled the air, fragments of condemnation and disbelief. Parents pulled their children closer as though to shield them from the bitterness that had unfolded so openly. The officers remained steadfast, documenting the scene with methodical care. They photographed the canister, collected statements, and treated the area as they would any crime scene. Their professionalism underscored the seriousness of the event. This was not to be buried under paperwork or dismissed as a misunderstanding. It was a clear violation, one that demanded accountability. The family stood silently as details were taken, their exhaustion visible yet overshadowed by determination. They knew the road ahead would not be easy. Legal proceedings, medical bills, for Atlas, and the emotional toll of the incident loomed large. But they also knew this was a turning point, one that might finally free them, and perhaps the entire neighborhood, from Karen's reign of intimidation. The night stretched on, filled with the hum of radios, the murmur of neighbors, and the quiet but unmistakable tension of justice in motion. The once ordinary street had become a stage for something larger, something that would ripple beyond its borders. Reports would be filed, evidence submitted, and the name of the woman who had once commanded fear would now carry infamy of another kind. When the last patrol car rolled away, leaving the neighborhood in silence once more, the community was forever changed. The flashing lights had faded, but the memory remained. etched into every heart that had witnessed it. For Karen, the silence was not relief, but dread. The power she once wielded had slipped through her fingers, replaced by the cold certainty of consequences. She stood alone, shrouded not in authority but in shame, knowing the days ahead would bring more than she had ever bargained for. And for the family, though worry weighed heavily on their hearts, hope flickered at last. The world had seen the truth, and the system had responded. Their loyal companion was receiving care, and justice had begun its course. But as they returned to their home, the shadows stretched long, carrying with them the knowledge that this was only the beginning. Karen would not surrender quietly, and the battle that lay ahead would test them in ways they had yet to imagine. The HOA turns on itself. The morning after the incident dawned with an uneasy stillness. The neighborhood, usually alive with the sounds of sprinklers, children riding bicycles, and neighbors exchanging polite greetings, carried instead a quiet tension. The events of the previous night still lingered heavily in the air, as if the flashing lights had left an invisible residue that stained every lawn, every mailbox, every painted door. News traveled faster than the rising sun. The images and videos recorded by neighbors spread like wildfire through private chats, community pages, and whispered conversations at breakfast tables. The sight of the infamous Karen spraying the service dog was replayed countless times, each viewing hardening opinions and fueling outrage. By the time most residents poured their morning coffee, the incident was not just a rumor, it was a fact etched into the collective consciousness of the community. For years, Karen had ruled the HOA board with an iron grip. She had allies, yes, but they were less partners than followers, intimidated into compliance by her relentless persistence. Few dared to oppose her, for fear of fines, harassment, or the humiliation of public shaming at community meetings. But now, for the first time, the unshakable authority she wielded seemed vulnerable. The board called an emergency session. It was to be held in the community hall, a modest building near the entrance of the neighborhood that had often served as the stage for Karen's displays of dominance. On this day, however, the atmosphere was markedly different. Residents filled the hall not with casual curiosity, but with simmering anger and a thirst for answers. Karen arrived early, her posture stiff, her expression a mask of forced confidence. She still clung to the belief that she could control the narrative, that her years of power and intimidation would shield her from the consequences. She framed herself in her own mind as the victim, the one unfairly targeted for enforcing rules in a community that had grown complacent. Yet as she entered the hall, the shift in the air was undeniable. The usual respectful silence she commanded was absent, replaced by hushed murmurs and cold stares. The board members, too, looked uneasy. Some had long resented her control, tolerating it only because it was easier than confrontation. Others had enjoyed the sense of authority by association, basking in the illusion of influence. But now, with the entire neighborhood watching and the weight of federal law looming, none seemed eager to defend her. The emergency session began with formalities, but the formality quickly gave way to outrage. Residents stood, one by one, recounting what they had seen or heard. Videos were played on phones and tablets, the evidence undeniable. The board listened in tense silence, their eyes darting toward Karen with a mixture of disbelief and dread. Karen attempted to assert herself, to dismiss the incident as exaggerated or misunderstood, but her words, though firm, fell flat against the overwhelming tide of testimony and proof. Each attempt to shift blame only deepened the anger of the community. Her once commanding voice now sounded hollow, desperate even, as neighbors she had, once silenced, spoke with newfound courage. The family who owned Atlas did not attend the meeting. They remained home, tending to their wounded companion and grappling with the emotional toll of the ordeal. Yet their absence spoke louder than words. The image of Atlas being led into the emergency vehicle the night before lingered in every mind, a silent testament to the cruelty inflicted upon him. The board, cornered by the outrage of the community, began to fracture. Some members distanced themselves from Karen, carefully choosing words that emphasized individual responsibility rather than collective guilt. Others called for immediate disciplinary action, recognizing that to do nothing would condemn the entire HOA to infamy. The once unified front that Karen had used to enforce her will was crumbling before her eyes. Karen's frustration grew. For years, she had thrived on control, bending rules to her favor, twisting situations until her version of events prevailed. But now the rules were larger than her, carved not by HOA bylaws, but by federal statutes. The harm done to a service animal was not something that could be smoothed over with fines or warnings. It was a crime with consequences beyond her reach. As the meeting dragged on, the board finally conceded to the demand for an investigation, not by their own standards, but in cooperation with law enforcement. It was a small victory for the community, but a devastating blow to Karen. Her name, once synonymous with authority, was now tied to scandal and disgrace. The whispers that followed her out of the hall were not of fear, but of condemnation. Back at the family's home, Atlas rested quietly. The veterinary team had flushed the chemicals from his eyes and fur, easing his pain, though not erasing it entirely. He was stable, strong enough to walk again, though his movements carried a stiffness that betrayed the ordeal. His presence remained a source of comfort, a reminder of resilience in the face of cruelty. The family sat close to him, vowing silently that they would see this through, not only for themselves, but for the companion who had given them so much. The days that followed only deepened the divide within the neighborhood. Some residents rallied, openly in support of the family, delivering food, sending kind messages, and expressing outrage at Karen's actions. Others, though privately disgusted, remained silent out of habit, unwilling to involve themselves too deeply. But the majority no longer saw Karen as a protector of order. They saw her for what she had become, a liability, a danger to the very peace she claimed to protect. Karen, meanwhile, grew restless. The walls of her home, once a sanctuary of control, now felt like a prison. Her reputation crumbled outside her door, her every movement scrutinized, her every action judged. She began drafting letters, filing complaints of her own, desperate, to paint herself as the victim of a witch hunt. Yet each effort only seemed to highlight her desperation, further alienating her from the community she once ruled. The legal process moved steadily forward. Reports were filed, statements collected, and the case grew stronger with each passing day. Karen's name now appeared not only in neighborhood gossip, but in official documents tied irrevocably to the assault on a service animal. She had crossed a line that no influence or intimidation could erase. And still, the neighborhood waited. They waited for the next letter from the HOA, for the next update from law enforcement, for the next development in a story that had already altered the fabric of their community. They waited, too, for Karen's inevitable response, knowing she would not accept her downfall quietly. The calm suburb had become a battlefield of reputations, legal consequences, and shifting loyalties. The once invincible Karen was faltering, yet her desperation hinted at storms still to come. The family braced themselves, the community held its breath, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not only justice for Atlas, but the future of the entire neighborhood. Retaliation and desperation, Karen had always been a woman of control. To her, power came not from kindness or respect, but from the ability to instill fear and impose order. Losing that grip felt like losing the very identity she had crafted for herself. As the days ticked by after the attack on the service dog, her once firm reputation lay in ruins. The whispers of her neighbors, the cold stares from the board, and the looming shadow of law enforcement suffocated her. Yet Karen was not one to surrender quietly. In her mind, defeat was not an option. If the community dared to turn against her, then she would fight back with every tool at her disposal. And so began her campaign of retaliation, a desperate attempt to claw back control of a world slipping rapidly from her grasp. The first signs appeared in the form of letters, long, rambling documents slipped into mailboxes, typed in bold fonts littered with accusations. She painted herself as the victim of a targeted smear campaign, claiming the family with the service dog had staged the incident to tarnish her reputation. She accused neighbors of conspiring against her, spreading lies, and exaggerating the truth. To those who read them, the letters felt unhinged, a desperate attempt to rewrite a story already carved in stone. But Karen did not stop there. She began filing formal complaints to the HOA board, citing violations that bordered on absurdity. A garden hose left uncoiled for 2 minutes, a recycling bin placed inches too close to the street, a flower planted outside of regulation color schemes. Each one was documented and sent with fury. The family with Atlas became the primary target, inundated with a barrage of notices that arrived with unnerving frequency. The family, already exhausted from the ordeal, recognized these actions for what they were: harassment. Yet rather than cower, they documented everything. Each letter, each notice, each baseless accusation was carefully preserved, handed over to the authorities building the case. Karen believed she was tightening the noose around her enemies, but in truth, she was weaving the rope of her own downfall. Meanwhile, the investigation progressed with relentless momentum. Federal authorities had been notified, and the protection of service animals became the central focus. Reports of Karen's actions spread beyond the confines of the neighborhood, reaching the desks of those who specialized in prosecuting such crimes. What once seemed like an isolated act of cruelty now took on the weight of a national issue. Neighbors, too, began to step forward. Emboldened by the shifting tides, many who had once stayed silent shared their own experiences. Stories of years of intimidation, unjust fines, and harassment painted a damning picture of Karen's reign. One by one, voices that had been silenced found their strength, contributing to a growing mountain of evidence that depicted Karen not as a protector, but as a predator. Still, Karen refused to yield. She doubled down on her campaign, staging scenes that she hoped would discredit the family. On one occasion, she stood outside their home, photographing their yard as if searching for violations invisible to the naked eye. On another, she spread rumors that Atlas was not truly a service dog, but merely a pet, claiming the family had exploited sympathy to cover misconduct. Each attempt, however, was met with derision rather than support. The community, once divided under her rule, now found unity in their disdain. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances, rolled their eyes at her theatrics, and quietly rallied around the family she targeted. Small acts of kindness appeared: fresh meals left on doorsteps, offers to walk Atlas during recovery, words of encouragement passed along in hushed tones. The more Karen lashed out, the more isolated she became. The HOA board could no longer ignore the crisis. Their emergency meetings turned into sessions of damage control, as the reputation of the entire association was now at stake. Property values, community image, and even legal liability hung in the balance. Karen, once the board's fiercest enforcer, had become its greatest liability. Pressure mounted from within and without to sever ties with her, to strip her of authority, before the fallout consumed them all. For the family, the days blurred into a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Atlas continued to recover, his strength returning slowly but steadily. Each wag of his tail, each determined step beside his owner, felt like a victory. The bond between them deepened further, forged in adversity and strengthened by loyalty. He remained a living reminder of why they endured, why they fought, and why they would see this through to the end. Karen's desperation escalated as her isolation grew. With neighbors avoiding her, the board distancing themselves and the law closing in, she retreated further into her own delusions. At night, lights flickered inside her home as she pored over documents, drafting endless complaints, each one more frantic than the last. The very walls that once signified her dominance now echoed with the hollow sound of paranoia. The breaking point came when she attempted to stage evidence. A late-night stunt involving scattered trash on her own lawn, photographed and presented as proof of harassment, backfired spectacularly. Surveillance cameras from multiple houses captured her planting the debris herself. When the footage surfaced, it spread across the community like wildfire, sealing her reputation not only as cruel, but as deceitful. The law, meanwhile, moved forward with precision. The case now held layers: animal cruelty, harassment, obstruction, and false claims. Each thread wove into a net that tightened around her. Federal prosecutors prepared their arguments, confident in the strength of the evidence. Karen's name was no longer feared. It was scorned, spoken with disdain in the very neighborhood she once ruled. The family, though weary, found solace in the community shift. The support they received reminded them they were not alone, that justice was not a solitary pursuit. Atlas, though scarred by the ordeal, walked with renewed pride, his harness once again a symbol of strength and dignity. He bore the marks of cruelty, but he also carried the resilience of survival. As weeks turned into months, the neighborhood transformed. What had once been a place of fear under Karen's watch grew into something resembling unity. Neighbors who had once hidden behind blinds now greeted one another openly, emboldened by the downfall of the tyrant who had held them captive. For the first time in years, the community felt free. But for Karen, the walls continued to close in. Each letter she wrote, each accusation she hurled, each desperate attempt to reclaim control only further exposed her unraveling. The reckoning she had feared was no longer a distant threat. It was imminent, inevitable, unstoppable. The stage was set for the final confrontation, where law and justice would collide with arrogance and denial. And as the neighborhood braced for the storm, one truth became undeniable. Karen's reign was over, but her consequences had only just begun. The courtroom reckoning. The courthouse loomed large, its stone columns casting long shadows across the steps where reporters gathered, cameras poised to capture every moment. What had begun as a neighborhood scandal had now grown into a case of national interest. News outlets carried the story of the HOA woman who sprayed a service dog, sparking outrage across communities that understood the sacred role these animals played. Karen, once a tyrant behind neatly trimmed hedges, now stood at the center of a legal storm she could no longer control. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Rows of benches were filled with curious onlookers, neighbors from the community, and advocates for disability rights who had come to witness justice in action. At the front, the federal court's seal hung proudly above the bench, a silent reminder that this was no longer about HOA politics. It was about law, dignity, and accountability. Karen sat stiffly at the defendant's table. Her once proud demeanor was cracked and brittle, a mask of confidence stretched thin over a face that betrayed exhaustion. Papers cluttered before her, her attorney flipping through them with hurried precision. Yet no stack of documents, no rehearsed defense could erase the images that had spread across the internet, the spray canister raised, the service dog recoiling in pain, the neighbors gasping in shock. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical clarity. They presented evidence not only of the attack itself, but also of the weeks that followed. Karen's harassment of the family, her desperate attempts to stage incidents, her relentless campaign of retaliation. Witnesses testified, neighbors who had once been silent now speaking freely. Their words painted a portrait of years under her control, culminating in an act so cruel it shattered any remaining illusion of authority. The veterinarian who treated, Atlas spoke next. With calm precision, they described the physical effects of the chemical spray, the burns to the eyes, the irritation of the lungs, the potential for permanent damage. Their testimony underscored the seriousness of the attack, reminding everyone that this was not an abstract violation of law, but a direct assault on a working partner whose role was critical to his owner's independence. The family entered the courtroom quietly, their presence drawing sympathetic glances. Atlas walked beside them, recovered enough to appear, but still carrying the dignity of one who had endured suffering. His harness gleamed under the courtroom lights, a visible reminder of his service and his importance. The sight of him silenced. The room, the gravity of the case made flesh in the steady steps of a loyal companion. Karen's defense leaned heavily on denial. They painted her as misunderstood, a victim of exaggerated outrage. They tried to frame the incident as an accident, a moment of poor judgment blown out of proportion. Yet each argument faltered against the mountain of evidence. The videos alone dismantled her claims, leaving little room for doubt. As the trial stretched over days, the weight of justice pressed ever heavier. The community's voice had been heard, the law had spoken, and the truth could no longer be buried. Karen's name, once wielded like a weapon, now echoed as a cautionary tale of arrogance unchecked. When the jury returned, the verdict carried the finality of thunder. Guilty on charges of animal cruelty, harassment, and violation of federal law protecting service animals. The words rippled through the courtroom, through the community, through the nation that had followed the story with bated breath. Karen sat frozen, her carefully constructed world crumbling to dust in an instant. The sentence was announced. Fines, community service, mandatory counseling, and a permanent record that would follow her wherever she went. But the most devastating blow was the public shame, the irreversible fall from the pedestal she had built for herself. Her reign was over, and her power was gone. Yet for the family, the verdict was more than punishment for Karen. It was vindication. Their suffering had been acknowledged, their loyalty to Atlas honored, their right to peace restored. The community, too, felt the weight lift. Years of intimidation dissolved into relief, and the neighborhood that had once lived under fear now stood united in newfound freedom. As the family left the courthouse, Atlas walked proudly beside them, his strength restored, his loyalty unbroken. He had endured cruelty, but emerged a symbol of resilience, a reminder of why the law protected service animals with such seriousness. The flashing lights that had once marked chaos now marked closure. Justice had been done. But even as the chapter closed on Karen's trial, a new story began within the community itself. Freed from tyranny, neighbors began to rebuild, not just their lawns and fences, but their trust in one another. The scars of the past would take time to fade, but they carried now a collective strength, born of standing together in the face of cruelty. And somewhere in the silence of her empty home, Karen faced the reality she had long denied, that her power had never been true authority, only fear. And fear, once broken, never returns. A neighborhood reborn. The weeks after the trial brought a transformation more profound than anyone had expected. The community, once fractured by years of intimidation, now discovered the freedom of living without fear. The removal of Karen's influence was like lifting a heavy curtain, allowing light to pour into places long shadowed by her dominance. The HOA board, shaken by the scandal, underwent sweeping changes. New leaders were elected, chosen not for their willingness to enforce, with severity, but for their commitment to fairness and respect. Meetings that had once been battlegrounds of accusations turned into genuine discussions of improvement. Residents spoke freely, their voices carrying not the tremor of fear but the steadiness of confidence. For the first time in years, the community felt truly theirs. The family with Atlas became a quiet symbol of resilience. They never sought attention, but their story spread far beyond the neighborhood. Disability advocates praised their courage, news outlets hailed their perseverance, and communities across the country took notice. Atlas himself became a figure of inspiration, his image shared as a reminder of loyalty and survival. Children in the neighborhood greeted him with joy, parents pointed to him as a lesson in kindness, and neighbors who once whispered in fear now spoke with admiration. Karen's absence was felt, but not in the way she imagined. Her house, once the seat of intimidation, stood dark and uninviting. Grass grew untrimmed, weeds sprouted along the edges, and the mailbox, once polished to perfection, gathered dust. She had moved away quietly, unable to withstand the stares and whispers that followed her every step. Where she went mattered little. What mattered was that her reign had ended, leaving behind a neighborhood stronger in her absence. The change extended beyond simple relief. Neighbors began connecting in ways they never had before. Barbecues returned to backyards, children played freely in the streets, and laughter replaced the hush of fear. Gardens bloomed without fear of fines, decorations hung proudly without concern for arbitrary restrictions. The community discovered not only peace but joy, something they had nearly forgotten. For the family, healing came slowly but steadily. Atlas regained his full strength, his steps confident once more. He continued his service faithfully, but he also enjoyed the love and admiration showered upon him by those who had witnessed his ordeal. His scars, both visible and unseen, became part of a story that reminded everyone of the importance of compassion, law, and justice. The ordeal had been painful, but it left behind a powerful legacy. The neighborhood was no longer a place of silent submission. It was a community united, strengthened by the trial they had endured together. The shadow of Karen's tyranny no longer lingered. It had been replaced by sunlight, growth, and a determination never to allow fear to rule again. The story of HOA Karen lived on, not as a tale of her dominance, but as a warning of what happens when entitlement collides with justice. Her downfall became a lesson repeated in conversations across towns and cities. That cruelty, no matter how small or hidden behind rules, carries consequences. And so, life returned to the neighborhood, richer and freer than before. Families thrived. Laughter echoed down the streets, and Atlas walked with quiet pride, the hero whose suffering had sparked change. The community would never forget what had happened, but neither would they forget the resilience that carried them through. For in the end, it was not Karen's cruelty that defined them, but their courage to confront it. And from that courage, a neighborhood was reborn.